The U.S. Justice Department rejected the voter ID law passed by the Republican majority in the Texas legislature last session. Any chance of Texas voting laws has to be cleared first by the feds if there's going to be a change. The Justice Department says getting a photo ID would disproportionately affect poor and minority voters. But Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott says the impact is a minor inconvenience compared to ensuring the integrity of elections. The other option for Texas is to get clearance from the federal courts in Washington, D.C. We've got the primary coming up. Then we've got the November election the presidential election in November. So what are Texas voters supposed to do? What are they supposed to know? We've got two guests tonight to help us out. Attorney Chris Gober, who's worked with several Republican candidates, and Democratic State Representative Lon Burnam in our Fort Worth Bureau. Chris, Attorney General Eric Holder said requiring photo ID is a solution in search of a problem. So where's the voter fraud that's causing legislatures to write these photo ID laws?
Well, you hear a lot of opponents of this legislation claiming that there are no instances of voter fraud, that this is some kind of myth, but really that blatantly disregards the facts that are out there. I mean, just since 2002, the Department of Justice itself has charged over 100 individuals with election fraud, and the Texas Attorney General has convicted another 50 individuals with election fraud here in the state of Texas. You know, just last year I was here debating this issue when this legislation was passed. Shortly thereafter, a local leader of the NAACP in Mississippi was sentenced to 5 years in prison for voting on behalf of 10 individuals, 4 of which were deceased. So I think any claim that voter fraud is a myth or does not exist, you know, it simply ignores the truth.
Okay, but Chris, you just identified like 160 cases versus millions.
Well, I think, you know, one thing you have to look at here is, you know, this is a type of voter fraud that is harder to document. I don't know that it, you know, I can certainly say that it's probably not the most prevalent form of voter fraud, but one thing we don't know either is how much of the voter fraud would be detected had, you know, if we had photo ID laws in place like the one that was passed in the state of Texas and has been passed in other states across the country.
Representative Burnam, if voting is the core of our democracy, what's wrong with expecting people to prove who they are? Does fraud have to become widespread and be a problem first?
Well, there isn't widespread fraud, and that is a misconception that's being presented. And more importantly, more specifically, there's not widespread use of ID issues. The reality is, it is a right to vote. It's been a long struggle. People have fought and died for it for 4 centuries now. Where we are at this point in time, 50 years ago, we adopted the Voting Rights Act. We think that's good. We think it needs to be enforced. We think that this voter ID legislation was designed specifically, and if you look at the numbers, to disenfranchise Hispanics and African Americans and other minority groups. They are specifically protected under the Voting Rights Act, and that's the reason the Attorney General's, the Justice Department has sent this letter back to Texas. Unfortunately, our Attorney General is going to spend a lot of money trying to appeal that or try to reverse that.
Chris, what's your response to that? Is it voter suppression?
Well, I think if you look at the, the fundamental, basis of the bill, it largely mimics and follows other voter ID laws that have been passed in other states that were sued upon and that were ultimately accepted as constitutional by the United States Supreme Court. Obviously, I think that one thing that the Department of Justice's rejection of preclearance, did indicate, there could be some state-specific issues in the state of Texas that could be raised here that, maybe would impact the state of Texas differently than some of these other states. But I think to characterize this piece of legislation as being, to have the goal of voter suppression is just absolutely nonsense.
You don't have to show a photo ID when you vote by mail, and that seems that could be a more likely way to cheat. Why not try and address that first?
Well, I think, first of all, you got to look at a federal law that's already in place. The first time you register to vote, if you register to vote by mail, the federal law already requires you to submit a form of identification with that mail or the first time you show up to vote. So the idea that this is the first time that we're requiring any type of photo ID in the election process, that's also a misstatement because federal law already requires that.
Representative, the Justice Department approved Georgia's photo ID law in 2005. The Supreme Court upheld Indiana's voter ID law in 2008. Are groups aligned with Democrats going to keep suing until they just get lucky? Representative?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question, but I mean, I didn't hear how you directed the question. No. And in fact, what we see is a continuing effort across this country to have a negative impact on voter participation. If you look at the numbers, the research here, anywhere from 6 to 19% of the people that are registered to vote could be disenfranchised with this law. And contrary to the other spokesperson, we have a lot of examples to show through the amendment process in the legislative session last time, the Democrats tried to make the bill less reprehensible, but the Republicans were so intent on cramming down an obviously unconstitutional, illegal law that they passed it the way they wanted to pass it. We'll end up dealing with this legislation again in the next legislative session, but the net impact, the net desire, the people that are advocating this legislation, they're trying to undermine voter participation.
So, Representative, we've got the primary coming up, and then, of course, the election in November. What do voters in Texas need to know about what they need to provide when they go to vote?
Well, they're not going to have to show a voter ID this time. They'll need to show some sort of identification, as we've always asked voters to do. But what voters need to be aware of is if this type of legislation is implemented, we're going to have a high percentage of our voters that are going to be turned away for any number of reasons that are spurious and not be able to vote. And that's the reason we'll be continuing to fight this type of legislation.
And Chris, you do see this issue coming up again for the next legislature?
I think that is a possibility. We'll obviously see what the D.C. District Court has to say when they get into the statistics to determine what kind of impact the legislation will have on minority voters.
And that would be an April 9th deadline that we'll be looking at. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for this discussion.
Thanks for having us.